I couldn't close out an analysis of slavery in the New Testament without a look at a recent analysis by a scholar whom we've quoted here favorably. Jennifer Glancy's Slavery in Early Christianity is overall a careful and detailed scholarly work that offers sometimes neglected insights into ancient Roman slavery. But Glancy says some things about the use of slaves for sexual purposes that deserves our attention. As you might suppose, Roman masters were known to make use of their slaves for sexual purposes. How often this happened and in what context is not something we can readily say. But Glancy believes it happened often enough that the New Testament ought to have said something about it, and she has some misgivings about the fact that it doesn't. From a moral perspective, I can understand Glancy's concerns, but there are a few points to consider. Mid-first century churches were not so large that it was even close to guaranteed that they would have among their number confessing Christian masters who sexually used their slaves and would need correction. It's more likely, on the other hand, that there were some slaves in the church that were being so used by their non-Christian masters, and Glancy more than once speculates that there may have been some problem with such slaves participating in Christian fellowship. Or, as she puts it, Paul's teachings on sexuality would have complicated and even barred the participation of many slaves in Christian life. But that's far from certain. First of all, if such slaves did exist in the church, it's hardly likely that they were putting their troubles out on Front Street, advertising that their masters shamed them in such a profoundly embarrassing way. So someone like Paul, or a church leader, would be unlikely to be put into the position of making decisions about such a person. But even if they were, such a slave would have been understood by Paul and other Christians to have been raped by their non-Christian master, if they were not willingly participating in the sexual acts. After all, the slave was subject to coercion in the matter, and could no more be charged with sin than a person who had been robbed or murdered. But again, I rather expect the chances that Paul even did run into such a situation were rather small. And furthermore, had he done so, he would have done it years before the New Testament letters when he first encountered those churches. Glancy also makes much of 1 Thessalonians 4, 3-8, and Paul's advice that each should seek his own vessel. She rejects the idea that it refers to a spouse, and suggests that it was Paul making leeway for the acquisition of a slave with which one could enjoy sexual relations. Paul, however, was writing his letter to the entire Thessalonian congregation, not merely males with enough resources to own slaves. The recipients of the letter would have included slaves as well as poorer persons unable to purchase or support slaves. Yet Paul's advice is to each man or person, not merely those who might be able to own slaves. By Glancy's reading, Paul must assume that poor people and slaves can also buy their own sexual slaves or vessels. Glancy is also aware that it can be argued that commands against fornication would exclude Christian masters from having sex with their slaves. This argument she tries to subvert with a loophole. Maybe, she suggests, Paul didn't understand it that way, and sex with slaves wasn't fornication since they were property. But again, she relies heavily on an understanding that the word vessel refers to some inanimate, morally neutral object like a slave. Glancy tries to block off the reference as being to spouses, particularly wives, by saying that it is not a particularly dignified reference to women. But other uses of the same word inform the matter better. In Romans 9:22-3, Paul uses the same word to refer metaphorically to what could only be all humans, regardless of gender or status. Likewise in 2 Corinthians 4:7. In 2 Timothy 2:21, the word is used of men's bodies only. 1 Peter 3:7, though it refers to women as the weaker vessel, if we are to take the comparative seriously, indicates that men too are vessels.